I believe the American people deserve to see.
A select group of lawmakers have seen the video. Democrats saying they saw the targets of the strike as defenseless and shipwrecked, a potential violation of international law. ABC News has reported the video showed the survivors waving before the follow-up strike that killed them. Top administration officials briefed congressional leadership Tuesday behind closed doors, but Democrats said Secretary Hegseth balked at releasing the unedited video.
His answer, we have to study it. Well, in my view, they've studied it long enough.
President Trump has walked back his support for a release of the video.
So she stands there in the fluorescent light of a news studio with her measured voice and composed demeanor, describing the unthinkable, articulating the impossible contradiction that has become the American norm, that your neighbor, the nice man next door in one of the safest communities in the nation, could stockpile weapons of war and deploy them against elementary school children, while the political machinery of the Republican Party does everything in its power to ensure that tomorrow, another neighbor in another safe community can do exactly the same thing. And you want to understand something visceral about what Poe Murray is revealing in this moment, because she's not just marking the 12th anniversary of Sandy Hook as groups renew calls for gun control, cause she is documenting the moral bankruptcy of an entire political movement that has decided 20 dead children were an acceptable price for ideological purity and campaign contributions from merchants of death. The horror compounds when you realize that 20 children and 6 educators lost their lives, and we can recite these numbers with the grim familiarity of multiplication tables because they've been drilled into our collective consciousness through sheer repetitive trauma, yet here we are 12 years later, and the fundamental architectures of gun violence remains not only intact but reinforced by a conservative apparatus that treats every mass shooting as an opportunity to double down on their perverse interpretation of constitutional rights, while families bury their babies. The cognitive dissonance she describes when she talks about the shock of discovering that her neighbor possessed an AR-15 in this supposedly safe community exposes the foundational lie of American gun culture, that these weapons make us safer when the empirical reality screams the opposite, 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 when the empirical reality screams the opposite. Mass shootings in which 6 or more deaths occurred increased by 347% in the decade after the assault weapons ban expired in 2004, the statistical apocalypse that would trigger immediate regulatory intervention in any other policy domain, but in this uniquely American hellscape prompts Republican lawmakers to suggest we simply need more guns. And you need to sit with what she's demanding, because when she talks about lobbying for an assault weapons ban, and universal background checks and repealing the gun industry's civil liability shield, she's not proposing radical socialism or constitutional subversion. She's advocating for policies that command majority support among Americans, including gun owners themselves, yet Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer promoted Democrats' attempts to pass an assault weapons ban, which Republicans blocked because the contemporary Republican Party operates as a wholly owned subsidiary of the firearms industry, where the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act passed in 2005 protects firearms manufacturers and dealers from being held liable when crimes have been committed with their products, though they can still be held liable for defective products and breach of contract, granting gun manufacturers a liability shield so sweeping that no other industry in America enjoys such protection. Imagine if pharmaceutical companies or automobile manufacturers or food producers could market products with reckless disregard for public safety and face zero legal accountability when their negligence kills people. Yet this is precisely the regime Republicans constructed for gun manufacturers, because they understand that the moment you allow tort liability to function normally, the economic incentives would force the industry to adopt safer practices, and we cannot have that when campaign coffers depend on maintaining maximum lethality. The national memory gap she references cuts to something even more sinister than collective forgetfulness, because 2023 endured the second highest number of mass shootings on record, but in 2024, the number fell to 499 mass shootings, 24% less than 2023, and we've normalized carnage to such a degree that a year with nearly 500 mass shootings represents progress, represents improvement, represents a statistical victory worth celebrating. While of the 5,151 children and teenagers under 18 who were shot in 2024, 1,403 died. This is the landscape Poe Murray navigates when she travels to Washington to lobby for change, confronting a Republican congressional delegation that blocked efforts by Senate Democrats to pass an assault weapons ban after the United States broke the record for the most mass shootings in a single year. Because for Republicans, each new massacre provides fresh evidence not that we need gun reform, but that we need to protect gun rights with even greater fervor. The perverse genius of conservative obstruction reveals itself in how Republican Senator John Barrasso objected to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's request for unanimous consent to pass the assault weapons ban, despite the pleas of Democratic senators who took to the Senate floor to cite the harrowing statistics of gun violence in America. Wrapping their refusal to act in constitutional rhetoric about Second Amendment sanctity, while ignoring the efforts to pass a new federal assault weapons ban, were made in December 2012, after Sandy Hook with Senator Feinstein introducing the assault weapons ban of 2013, but on April 17, 2013, it failed on a Senate vote of 40 to 60. 20 dead children couldn't move 60 senators to support an assault weapons ban, which tells you everything about the moral calculus of the modern Republican Party, that no body count will ever be sufficient to overcome their ideological commitment to unlimited gun rights and their financial dependence on gun industry money. And the sophistication of Republican obstruction operates on multiple levels because President Biden marked the 12th anniversary of Sandy Hook with a pitch for Congress to act on gun reform, listing universal background checks, red flag laws, safe storage requirements and bans on assault weapons as first steps, while knowing that Republicans control the House and aren't likely to give Biden a win on his way out, and the incoming Congress is firmly in GOP hands with enough of a majority to keep gun control from passing if everyone stays true to their stated principles, meaning that Republicans have constructed a systematic blockade against any meaningful gun reform, regardless of public opinion or death tolls, because their entire political identity has become fused with gun maximalism. This isn't policy disagreement or good faith constitutional interpretation. This is a political movement that has decided dead children are an acceptable externality of their ideological project, and they will deploy every procedural mechanism and rhetorical smokescreen to ensure that the killing continues. The liability shield dimension deserves particular attention because PLCAA gives the gun industry exceptional immunity from most civil liability, protecting the irresponsible gun companies responsible for most guns used in crimes, following a series of lawsuits in the 1990s holding certain gun industry members accountable for reckless business practices. And this represents regulatory capture so complete that it would make the robber barons blush. When tort litigation threatened to impose financial consequences on gun manufacturers who flooded secondary markets with weapons they knew would end up in criminal hands, the industry didn't improve their practices. They purchased legislation immunizing themselves from accountability. The NRA identified PLCAA as their #1 legislative priority, celebrating its passage as the most significant piece of pro-gun legislation in 20 years, because they understood that removing market-based incentives for responsible behavior would unleash an era of maximal profitability regardless of social cost. The 3 decades since Sandy Hook, families have been traveling to D.C. lobbying for sea change policies represents an obscenity of democratic dysfunction, because imagine possessing the moral courage to transform your trauma into advocacy work to prevent other families from experiencing the same horror, only to encounter Republican Senator Barrasso arguing that the Democratic-drafted assault weapons ban would infringe on the Second Amendment and deprive law-abiding gun owners of important liberty, that Democrats are trying to ban many types of semi-automatic firearms because of the way they look, asserting that AR-15s work the same way as popular shotguns and rifles used for hunting and personal protection, as if the weapon designed specifically for maximum human lethality in combat situations is functionally equivalent to a duck hunting shotgun. This gaslighting reaches pathological levels when Republicans suggest that banning weapons used to massacre children represents tyranny, while subjecting every American to the constant threat of mass violence represents freedom. The historical context illuminates how we arrived at this nightmare, because the original assault weapons ban was crafted by Brady and signed into law in 1994 by President Bill Clinton, supported by Republicans and Democrats alike, but after intense lobbying by the corporate gun lobby and NRA, Congress allowed the law to sunset in 2004, and the consequences were catastrophic, with mass shooting fatalities dropping 70% during the 10-year period. The federal assault weapons ban was in effect, but in the next decade after the ban expired, over 300 people were shot and killed in 34 mass shootings, representing a sharp increase in massacres and fatalities. This constitutes a natural experiment in public policy, with results so unambiguous that any rational political system would immediately reinstate the proven intervention. Yet Republicans looked at this data and decided that gun industry profits matter more than human lives. The constitutional arguments deployed by Second Amendment absolutists deserve intellectual demolition, because when Republican Senator Barrasso declares that Americans have a constitutional right to own a firearm, and every day people across Wyoming responsibly use their Second Amendment rights, asserting the Second Amendment is freedom's essential safeguard, and without it there can be no liberty and no security, he's promulgating a maximalist interpretation that the Supreme Court itself didn't endorse until the Heller decision in 2008, which represented a radical departure from centuries of jurisprudence. The Second Amendment in its historical context concerned well-regulated militias in an era of muzzle-loading muskets, not individual rights to stockpile military-grade weapons capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, and the intellectual dishonesty required to pretend that the framers would have endorsed AR-15s in every household would be laughable if it weren't facilitating mass slaughter. And you want to understand the systematic nature of Republican obstruction, because it's not just voting against gun reform bills. House Republicans looking to use the appropriations process to block a proposed rule to implement a provision included in the first bipartisan anti-gun violence package passed in years, with a new version of the fiscal 2024 Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill, adding a provision that would prohibit federal funds from being spent to enforce that rule, meaning that even when bipartisan compromise produces modest gun safety measures, Republicans immediately work to sabotage implementation through appropriations riders and bureaucratic interference. This reveals that Republican opposition to gun reform isn't principled constitutional conservatism, it's scorched earth obstruction, designed to ensure that no gun safety policy can ever be effectively implemented, regardless of legislative process or democratic will. The current political moment carries additional urgency, because the GOP in its first official platform since 2016 slashed all mention of gun policy positions, with the entire platform discussing gun rights just once in a preamble statement about defending fundamental freedoms, including the right to keep and bear arms, omitting any discussion of tangible gun policy ideas, which actually makes the situation more dangerous because explicit policy positions can be debated and contested, but vague invocations of freedom provide cover for maximal obstruction while maintaining plausible deniability. When Republicans won't even articulate specific gun policies in their platform, it signals that their actual agenda is too extreme to state publicly, because Americans might recoil at the honest admission that Republicans will never support any gun safety measure under any circumstances, regardless of body count. Poe Murray talking about assault weapons bans and background checks and repealing liability shields connects to concrete legislative fights because the House passed legislation in 2022 that would ban assault weapons for the first time since 2004, in a largely party-line vote of 217-13, with 2 Republicans voting for the measure and 5 Democrats opposing it. But the level of GOP opposition indicates the bill is unlikely to advance in the evenly split Senate, where it would require the support of at least 10 Republicans to defeat a guaranteed filibuster. This illuminates how Republican obstruction functions through both open opposition and procedural abuse, using the filibuster as a mechanism to impose minority rule on gun policy, ensuring that even when the House passes reform and public opinion supports change, a small number of Republican senators can veto the Democratic will. The sophistication of gun industry lobbying deserves analysis because gun extremists throw money at lobbyists with gun profiteers, spending a record $15.8 million on lobbying in 2021, over 5 times the amount spent by gun reform advocates, creating such massive resource asymmetry that gun safety organizations are fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. And the lobbying extends beyond direct advocacy to the Dickey Amendment passed in 1996 and not fully repealed until 2020, blocking the CDC from even studying the effects of guns on public health, meaning Republicans understood that empirical research into gun violence would generate evidence supporting regulation, so they simply defunded the research. This represents knowledge suppression so brazen that it would make tobacco companies envious, deliberately creating an information vacuum to prevent data-driven policymaking from challenging ideological commitments. And the racial dimensions of gun violence make Republican obstruction even more morally unconscionable, because Black people experience nearly 10 times the gun homicides, 18 times the gun assault injuries, and 3 times the fatal police shootings of white people in the U.S. according to Everytown research, meaning that Republican refusal to address gun violence disproportionately condemns Black communities to violence and death. This connects gun policy to broader patterns of structural racism, where Republicans defend policies that produce racially disparate harm while claiming color blindness, where the same party that wraps itself in law and order rhetoric when discussing crime in Black neighborhoods suddenly discovers libertarian principles when discussing policies that might reduce the gun violence, devastating those communities. The contrast between Republican rhetoric and policy outcomes illuminates their fundamental bad faith, because they claim to oppose gun reform to protect law-abiding citizens, yet basic background checks have blocked over 3 million illegal dangerous gun sales in the past 20 years, but half the states still permit easy and in some cases, totally untracked access to guns via online sales and gun shows, allowing guns into the hands of felons, abusers, gun traffickers, and others ineligible to purchase firearms. If Republicans genuinely cared about keeping guns out of criminal hands, they would support universal background checks and closing the gun show loophole, but instead they've constructed a regulatory regime that maximizes gun availability, regardless of purchaser qualification, because the actual priority isn't public safety, it's gun industry profits and ideological purity. When Poe Murray describes 13 years of lobbying, she's documenting the exhausting reality of advocacy in a political system where one party has abandoned democratic responsiveness entirely, because Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy posted that he begs people to commit themselves to creating a nation where mass shootings never happen again, while Senator Bernie Sanders demanded Congress take on the NRA and pass life-saving gun safety legislation. Now, yet these passionate appeals bounce off Republican obstruction like bullets off armor plating. The asymmetry is staggering, with Democrats proposing evidence-based policies supported by public majorities, while Republicans offer thoughts and prayers and constitutional bromides, with families of gun violence victims begging for action while Republican senators collect NRA campaign contributions and block every reform. The ghost gun dimension adds contemporary urgency because ghost guns have emerged as the biggest threat, as they are untraceable and can be made on a kitchen table with a 3D printer, and it's believed that the gun used to kill United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson was a ghost gun, representing technological developments that render existing regulations increasingly obsolete. Yet Republicans oppose regulations on ghost guns just as they oppose every other gun safety measure, because the through line isn't constitutional principle, it's maximal obstruction of any policy that might reduce gun availability or industry profitability, creating a ratchet where guns become ever more accessible and lethal, while regulations remain frozen in past decades. And you need to understand what makes this moment different from previous gun reform debates, because Congress passed tougher gun laws for the first time in decades 2 years ago, with Senator Chris Murphy saying years of gun reform efforts culminated in the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which President Biden signed into law, enhancing background checks, financially supporting red flag laws, and aiming to crack down on gun trafficking, representing the first successful federal gun legislation in nearly 30 years. This matters because it demonstrates that the Republican wall against gun reform can be breached through sustained organizing and public pressure, that the Sandy Hook families and gun violence survivors who've been lobbying for over a decade achieved something that was declared politically impossible. But the victory remains incomplete, because the bipartisan Safer Communities Act represents modest incremental change rather than transformative reform, and 41 Senate Republicans back a joint resolution to stop an ATF rule expanding background checks, with Senator Cornyn, who had negotiated the 2022 gun violence prevention law, saying that every time they ask for bipartisanship and you provide bipartisan solutions, then they overreach and undermine any sort of good faith negotiations, meaning Republicans who voted for limited gun reforms now work to sabotage their implementation. This exposes the cynicism at the heart of Republican positioning, where they occasionally support minimal reforms to deflect political pressure, then immediately undermine those reforms through regulatory interference, ensuring that no gun safety policy can ever be fully effective. The systematic
obstruction extends to every lever of government power, because Republicans don't just vote against gun reform bills, they appoint judges who strike down gun safety laws, and they use appropriations riders to defund enforcement, and they pressure regulatory agencies to weaken implementation, and they pressure regulatory agencies to weaken implementation, and they pressure regulatory agencies to weaken implementation, deploy state-level preemption laws to prevent cities from adopting local gun regulations. This represents a comprehensive strategy to ensure that gun reform fails at every institutional level, creating a political system where the majority will on gun policy cannot be translated into effective law regardless of electoral outcomes or public opinion trends. And the propaganda dimension requires attention, because Speaker Mike Johnson told Fox News the problem is the human heart, not guns, not the weapons, saying it was not the time to consider additional legislation, and his party was united around protecting Second Amendment rights.
Deploying the standard Republican deflection that gun violence results from moral decay or mental health rather than gun availability. This rhetoric serves to mystify causation and prevent material interventions by locating the problem in unfixable human nature rather than addressable policy failures, suggesting that we need prayer and character education rather than gun regulation, as if other countries don't have violent video games and mental illness, but somehow avoid our epidemic of mass shootings. We are the only nation experiencing this epidemic, and there are common-sense policies that the majority of Americans agree with and that Congress can easily take action on, according to President Biden's statement, and this is empirically undeniable. Every peer nation with strong gun regulations has dramatically lower rates of gun violence, proving that policy choices matter, and that the American carnage results from political decisions, not inevitable human nature. Yet Republicans continue to pretend that gun violence is some mysterious phenomenon, rather than the predictable consequence of treating firearms as consumer products, subject to less regulation than children's toys. Poe Murray demanding repeal of the gun industry's civil liability shield targets perhaps the most corrupt element of our gun policy regime, because PLCAA allows the gun industry to avoid the financial incentives to implement safe and responsible business practices, encourages head-in-the-sand behavior that gets in the way of safety innovations, and gives the most irresponsible industry members an unfair business advantage over their more responsible competitors who do take precautions to protect human life and well-being. This perversely incentivizes race-to-the-bottom business practices where manufacturers who exercise restraint face competitive disadvantages while those who flood markets with maximum lethality enjoy immunity from consequences, creating market dynamics that actively reward corporate irresponsibility. The legal battles over PLCAA illustrate how gun reform advocacy must fight on multiple fronts because several states have enacted legislation to establish a standard of conduct for the marketing and sale of firearms and ensure that victims or public officials have the ability to bring civil lawsuits against firearm industry actors who violate that standard. Representing state-level efforts to work around federal obstruction. This shows how gun reform must proceed through patchwork state actions when Republicans block federal progress, creating a fragmented regulatory landscape where protection from gun violence depends on zip code rather than representing a universal right of citizenship. And you want to grasp the stakes, because a total of 711 people were killed, and 2,375 people were wounded in 586 mass shootings in 2024, which represents just mass shootings defined as 4 or more victims, not including the much larger toll of daily gun violence in American communities. When we zoom out from individual tragedies to systemic patterns, the scale of preventable death becomes overwhelming, constituting a public health catastrophe that would trigger immediate federal intervention in any policy domain not captured by a wealthy industry and its political surrogates. The school shooting dimension carries particular horror because the overall number of school shootings in 2024 that resulted in injuries or deaths slightly outpaced 2023's tally, with 39 school shootings meeting criteria for Education Week's tracker, the second highest total for any year since Education Week began tracking in 2018, meaning that despite Sandy Hook, despite Parkland, despite Uvalde, we continue subjecting children to violence in educational spaces that should represent safety. Republicans respond to school shootings by proposing armed teachers and hardened campuses, transforming schools into fortresses rather than addressing the root cause of gun availability, because their entire political project requires maintaining that guns enhance rather than threaten safety. The Alex Jones dimension adds layers of cruelty because the controversial media platform InfoWars led by conspiracy theorist Alex Jones remains at the center of a legal battle tied to Sandy Hook, with Jones widely condemned for promoting the false claim that the shooting was a hoax, his defamation of victims' families leading to a landmark lawsuit, and Jones now facing over $1 billion in damages. This represents how the right-wing media ecosystem doesn't just obstruct gun reform through conventional political means, but actively harasses and defames the victims of gun violence, adding reputational and emotional violence to their physical trauma, with prominent conservatives amplifying conspiracy theories that the families of murdered children are crisis actors engaged in false flag operations, and the organizing imperative becomes clear, because Poe Murray and countless other gun violence survivors and advocates have been doing this work for over a decade, achieving incremental progress through exhausting persistence, and they're not stopping because the memory of the Sandy Hook tragedy continues to fuel efforts to prevent gun violence across the nation, with organizations like Sandy Hook Promise working to educate and empower communities while fighting for legislative action on gun control remains as urgent as ever. This grassroots infrastructure of gun violence prevention organizations represents the only counterweight to gun industry money and Republican obstruction, building power through survivor testimony and public education and electoral accountability. The momentum question matters because although Republicans control incoming congressional majorities and will likely block new federal gun legislation, the organizing continues at state and local levels where no federal assault weapons ban currently exists since the 1994 law expired in 2004, but 10 states and D.C. have a version of an assault weapons ban, including California, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and Washington, proving that gun reform can succeed when Republicans don't control all levers of government. This demonstrates that the political battle over guns isn't won or lost in single legislative fights but through sustained organizing across multiple jurisdictions, building incremental progress despite obstruction. The demographic and generational dimensions suggest that political winds may eventually shift because many of the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting survivors graduated in 2024, over a decade after the massacre in Newtown left 20 students and 6 educators dead, meaning that an entire generation has grown up under the shadow of school shooting drills and gun violence trauma, experiencing this crisis viscerally, in ways that older Americans might intellectualize. When these young people fully enter political participation, demanding that their leaders address gun violence rather than offering empty rhetoric, the Republican coalition built on gun absolutism may face electoral consequences that finally break the deadlock, and the call to action must emphasize that Republican obstruction on gun reform isn't inevitable or natural. It's a political choice that can be reversed through electoral accountability and organizing pressure, because Democrats have demonstrated willingness to pass gun reform when they have majorities, while Republicans have demonstrated total obstruction. This means that every election where gun policy remains a voting issue, every primary challenge to NRA-funded incumbents, every grassroots mobilization demanding action contributes to building the political power necessary to overcome Republican resistance, and finally, implement policies that the majority of Americans support and that would save thousands of lives annually. So when Poe Murray describes 13 years of lobbying for an assault weapons ban and universal background checks and repealing gun industry liability shields, she's not describing futile activism or performative advocacy. She's documenting the patient multi-year organizing work required to shift political landscapes and build toward transformative change, despite seemingly insurmountable Republican obstruction. The moral clarity of her position that weapons designed for maximum human lethality should not be available in civilian markets contrasts with the moral bankruptcy of Republicans who defend gun industry profits over children's lives, and this clarity must animate continued organizing, because the only alternative to sustained resistance is acceptance of perpetual carnage as the price of Republican ideology. The anniversary commemoration matters not for ritualistic mourning, but as mobilization moment where we channel grief into political power, where we transform the memory gap she describes into sustained attention, where we refuse to let America move on quickly from mass shootings until America finally implements policies to prevent them. Because 12 years after Sandy Hook, with hundreds of thousands dead from gun violence, the political equation remains brutally simple. Democrats support evidence-based gun reform that would save lives while Republicans obstruct every measure to protect gun industry profits and ideological commitments, meaning that gun violence will continue until Republicans either change their positions or lose sufficient political power that they can no longer block reform. And achieving that outcome requires exactly what Poe Murray has been doing for 13 years, building survivor-led movements that refuse to accept bloodshed as normal, demanding that political leaders either act or face electoral consequences, organizing relentlessly toward the day when we finally prioritize children's lives over gun manufacturers' balance sheets and constitutional fetishism,